I don't know if that changed. I left the posting at the end of October. My contract ended and I did not apply to renew it, and I think we both knew why without saying it directly. I've been trying for 14 months to identify the exact moment I made the decision that mattered, the decision that I would, if given the chance, make differently. I thought for a long time that it was the satellite phone. That staying instead of driving to the highway that night was the thing, and maybe it was. Maybe if I'd followed Rule 7, I would have been positioned differently at 2 a.m. Maybe I would have had communication. Maybe something about what followed would have been different. But I don't think that's really it. I think the decision that mattered was earlier. I think it was the first time Mara showed me 31 pages of documentation and I felt the same helpless rage that she felt, and I channeled that rage into our informal system and told myself that the informal system was enough. That our parallel log and our radio check-ins and our campsite drive-bys added up to protection. It wasn't protection. It was the best available substitute for protection in the absence of the real thing. And those are not the same. The real thing, the thing that would have required a credible authority to act on credible documentation, that thing we never got, and I never pushed hard enough for it. I told myself that Mara had pushed and been rebuffed and that repeating her experience would just produce the same result, but I don't actually know that's true. I was a government employee with a job title and a contract. I had institutional standing she didn't have. I could have escalated in ways she couldn't. I chose not to, because escalating felt risky, and what we had felt adequate. It wasn't adequate. Patrice was fine. She is fine. She sent me an email 6 weeks later thanking me for my quick response, and she didn't know how close it had been, and I didn't tell her. But fine in this story is not evidence that the system worked. Fine is a coincidence. Fine is Mara moving fast enough in the dark on a night when I wasn't there. Mara still lives at the property outside Takini Ridge. We talk sometimes, not as often as I'd like, which is something I've accepted as my own doing, because talking to her requires sitting with what we didn't accomplish. She told me in November that the file was still open. She told me in February that there had been no new developments. She told me in April, 7 months after the season ended, that she'd seen signs of a camp near the river corridor. Not conclusive, just signs. She's still watching. She's been watching for 8 years. She will probably keep watching, because nobody else is. That's the thing I can't make peace with. Not the fear of what almost happened, though that's real. Not the system that failed to help us, though that's real too. It's Mara. Specifically, Mara. 44 years old, 8 years of documentation, 12 rules written in blue ballpoint on a laminated sheet for someone she hadn't met yet. 8 years of being told it wasn't enough, and continuing anyway. I left, she stayed. I have a lot of reasons for leaving. Most of them are true. None of them are sufficient. The last thing she said to me before I drove out was that she'd leave the radio on Channel 7 in case I needed anything. I still turn to Channel 7 sometimes. The silence on that frequency sounds different from the other ones. I'm not sure what I'm waiting for. I think maybe I'm waiting for a reason to go back that I can justify to myself. Something that lets me say I returned because circumstances required it, rather than because I walked away from something that mattered, and the walking has not, in 14 months, started to feel like the right choice. It hasn't started to feel like the right choice. I don't think it's going to. The last thing I want to tell you is where it ended. But if I start there, none of the rest of it makes sense. And I've spent 4 years trying to make it make sense, so bear with me. There's a photograph on my phone. I've looked at it maybe 600 times. It was taken at 11:14 p.m. on a Tuesday in October, in a field off Route 9 outside Cavett, Illinois, population 2,300, which is where I was a cop for 13 years before I stopped being one. The photograph shows a section of tall grass, a fence post, and about 8 feet of gravel shoulder. There is nothing unusual in the photograph. That's the problem. There should be. I took the photograph because of what I was standing next to when I took it, and whatever that was, it's not there. Let me tell you something about small-town police work that nobody tells you before you do it. It's not boring. People say it's boring. People from cities say it. People who watch television say it. They're wrong in a specific way that I think matters here. Small-town policing is not boring. It is repetitive. Those are different things. Boring means nothing is happening. Repetitive means the same things keep happening, to the same families, in the same locations, in the same sequence, with small variations, like a song you've heard so many times you can predict the next note before it plays. After about 3 years in Cavett, I knew the next note before it played. Almost always. The Hendersons on Millbrook Road. The call would come in around 10 p.m. on a Friday. Carl would have been drinking since 4. Marlene would have called her sister first, then us. By the time I got there, Carl would be on the porch, embarrassed, and Marlene would not want to press anything. I'd talk to Carl for 20 minutes, make sure everyone was physically intact, and leave. I came back to that house 41 times over 9 years. I knew every detail of that porch. The broken third step. The wind chime made from old keys. I'm not telling you this to say the job was easy. I'm telling you because the repetition is the thing that let me know when something was genuinely different. Because when something was genuinely different, it didn't feel like a new note in the same song. It felt like the music stopped. The first time the music stopped in connection with what I'm going to tell you was in late August, about 14 months before the night with the photograph. I was on a routine property check. We did those for residents who were traveling. Just drive by, make sure the lights were right, no signs of entry. Standard. I'd done hundreds of them. The property was the Voss place, out on the north end of Route 9. Delmar Voss, 63, retired, lived alone. He'd called the station to say he was visiting his daughter in Rockford for 10 days, and could someone keep an eye on the house? Nothing unusual about any of that. I'd done checks on his place before, 2 or 3 times over the years. I pulled up the long gravel drive, put my window down, did a visual sweep of the exterior. Porch light on, which he'd said he'd leave on. Front door closed. Garage closed. Everything where it should be. I was about to put the car in reverse when I noticed the mailbox. It was full, packed to the point where a catalog was sticking halfway out, bent where the door had been pressed shut against it, meaning someone had jammed it closed after the mail was already inside, which was strange because Delmar had only been gone 4 days. I got out of the car, and as soon as I stepped onto the gravel, I had the distinct sensation, and I know how this sounds, that something had just stopped moving. Not a sound, not a motion I could see, just the absence of motion, which is different. Like when you walk into a room and know someone was just there, even though no one is visible. The air had a texture to it. I stood on that gravel for probably 30 seconds without moving, which is a long time to stand still when you're not sure what you're waiting for. Then I shook it off, pulled the mail out of the box, took it to the porch, and went back to my car. I wrote in my log, property check, Voss residence, all clear, because it was all clear. Nothing was wrong. I just couldn't make the feeling go away. Delmar came home on schedule. I saw him at the hardware store about a week after he got back. He seemed fine. Normal. He asked about my daughter, who was 9 at the time, and had been in the youth soccer league he'd seen her play in. We talked for maybe 10 minutes. As I was leaving, I asked him casually whether anyone had been by his place while he was gone, a neighbor watering plants, anything like that. He said no. Then he paused and said, "Why, was something wrong?" I told him no, just a full mailbox. I'd moved it to the porch. He seemed to find that unremarkable. He thanked me for checking in. I drove back to the station and the feeling came back, and I pushed it down again because there was nothing to put in a report. There was no incident. There was a full mailbox and a feeling, and neither of those is a case. The actual case started 4 months later, in December. A woman named Paula Dreyer called the non-emergency line on a Monday afternoon to say her neighbor's car hadn't moved in a while, and she was worried. The neighbor was a man named Roy Stiller, 57, lived alone on Cutter Lane in a ranch house he'd owned for about 9 years. Paula wasn't sure exactly how long the car had been there. She thought maybe 5 days. She said she would have called sooner, but she didn't want to be the kind of person who called the police on their neighbor for no reason. I told her she'd done the right thing, and I'd swing by. Roy's car was in the driveway. A 2009 Chevy Silverado, dark green, dusting of snow on the hood that hadn't been disturbed. Newspaper on the front step. Lights off inside. I knocked. No answer. Knocked again, announced myself. Nothing. I called the station. Asked them to run Roy's name, see if there was any family contact information. Dispatch came back with a sister in Peoria. I called her. She hadn't heard from Roy in about 2 weeks, which she said was not totally unusual. They weren't close, but she was concerned. I went around back. The back door was unlocked. I went inside and I found Roy Stiller sitting in the kitchen. He was alive. He was sitting in a chair at the kitchen table with his hands flat on a table in front of him, palms down, and he was staring at the wall. Not at anything on the wall. At the wall itself, at a point maybe 4 feet up, where there was nothing. No picture, no mark, just drywall painted a pale yellow. He didn't look up when I came in. He didn't respond when I said his name. I put my hand on his shoulder and he blinked, slowly, like someone coming up from deep water, and he turned his head and looked at me, and his expression was, "I've tried to describe this to two different people and gotten nowhere, so let me try a different way. You know how when you see someone right after they've gotten very bad news, there's a moment before they've processed it where their face hasn't decided what to do yet? That window of 3 or 4 seconds where they're just a person, no reaction, no mask, no performance, just open." Roy Stiller's face had been in that window for days. He was physically fine. His vitals were normal. He wasn't dehydrated, wasn't injured, wasn't under the influence of anything as far as I or the paramedics who came after me could tell. His temperature was a little low, which you'd expect from a man sitting in a 58-degree house in December for an indeterminate number of days without moving much. He answered questions. He knew his name, his address, the date. Well, roughly. He thought it was Saturday. It was Monday. He was off by 2 days. He said he'd been sitting. I asked him what he meant. He said he'd been sitting because there was something he needed to understand and he hadn't understood it yet. I asked him what he was trying to understand. He looked back at the wall and said, "I don't know. I'll know it when I understand it. Dashwar." We got him to the hospital in Galena for observation. He stayed 2 nights. They found nothing wrong with him. No neurological event. No psychiatric break as such. No indication of substance use. He was assessed and released with a referral to an outpatient counselor, which, as far as I know, he never followed up on. I filed a report. Welfare check. Subject found unresponsive but physically unharmed. Transported for evaluation. Released. Case closed. Except I couldn't close it in my head. Because 2 weeks later, I ran into Delmar Voss at the gas station on Route 9, and he had the same look on his face. Not exactly. Not the full open window, but the edges of it, like a man who'd been sitting in front of something he couldn't understand and had recently decided to stand up and go outside instead. I asked how he was doing. He said fine, just tired. I asked if he'd been sleeping okay. He looked at me for a second too long and said, "Not really, but it's probably just the season." And he got in his car and left. I want to be careful here because I'm aware of how this sounds. I was a cop for 13 years in a town of 2,300 people. I know how to look for patterns that aren't there. I know the human brain's extraordinary gift for connecting unrelated dots and calling the line between them a discovery. I've seen it happen in investigations and I've caught myself doing it, and I know better. So when I say I started to notice something, I need you to understand that I spent significant time arguing myself out of it before I let myself take it seriously. But the thing about a pattern that's actually there is that it keeps showing up even when you're actively looking away. March. 7 weeks after the Roy Stiller call. A man named Gerald Fitch came into the station on a Thursday morning and asked to speak to someone. I was the one who sat down with him. Gerald was 44, worked maintenance at the school district, had lived in Cavett his whole life. He was not a man I'd ever had a call involving. Solid, practical, the kind of person who files his taxes in February. He said he wanted to report something, but he didn't know if it was a police matter. I said, "Tell me what it is, and we'll figure it out together." He said he'd lost about 9 days. Not lost them the way you lose a week when you're sick with something bad. Lost them the way you lose the first moments of a dream when you wake up. You know something was there, you can feel the shape of it, but when you reach for the content, there's nothing to grab. He said he remembered the first Tuesday of the month because it was his brother's birthday and they'd had dinner. He remembered the Friday of the following week because he'd had a root canal and it had been miserable and he'd spent the evening on the couch with ice packs. What was in between those 2 points was a kind of texture. He'd been at work, he'd been at home, he'd driven his usual routes, but none of it was accessible to him as specific memory. It was like asking someone to describe the color of every car they'd driven past on their last commute. You drove past them. You have no idea. I asked if this had happened before. He said no, never like this. I asked if he'd seen a doctor. He said yes. The doctor had said it sounded like a dissociative episode, possibly stress-related, and had recommended he follow up with a mental health professional. I asked why he come to us rather than a doctor. He said, "Because I don't think it's a me problem. In Stersa, I don't think it's a me problem." I wrote that sentence in my personal notebook that night. Not the case file. My personal notebook, which I kept separate, which I'd started keeping about a year into the job, as a way of processing things I couldn't put in official reports because there was nothing reportable in them. Impressions. Textures. The things that felt like something without being anything. Underneath Gerald's sentence, I wrote 4 names: Roy Stiller, Delmar Voss, Gerald Fitch, and one more, a woman named Cecile Marr, who come into the urgent care in January complaining of disorientation and had been sent home with a pamphlet about anxiety management. I knew about her because her daughter was in my daughter's class, and her daughter had mentioned at a school event that her mom wasn't doing well. When I'd asked a few gentle questions, the daughter, she was 9, same as mine, had said her mom kept sitting at the window. 4 people, all in Cavett, all in the same 6-month window, all presenting with some version of the same thing: a vacancy, a gap, a sense of having been somewhere that wasn't anywhere, none of them connected to each other. Different ages, different parts of town, different social circles, different lives. The one thing they shared was that they all lived within about a mile of Route 9. I drove Route 9 one Saturday in March with no particular plan. It's a 2-lane county road, mostly farmland, cuts north to south through Cavett and extends about 12 miles in either direction before hitting anything significant. On the north end past Delmar Voss's place, there's a stretch of about 3 miles that's almost completely undeveloped. Grass, old fencing, a couple of fields that have been fallow for years. No structures, no driveways. Cell coverage is mediocre. I drove that stretch slowly. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I wasn't even sure what specific would look like. I was doing what you do when the only tool you have is attention. You point it somewhere and see what happens. What happened was nothing, except about 2.2 miles north of the Cavett limit sign, on the east side of the road, there was a gap in the old fence line. Post missing, wire pulled back. Could have been there for years. Probably had been. The grass beyond it was flattened in a broad, irregular area that extended maybe 30 feet back from the road before the natural growth took over again, like something had rested there, or a lot of somethings, over a long period. I pulled over and got out. It was cold. Wind coming out of the northwest, flat and gray. The kind of day that discourages lingering. I stood at the gap in the fence and looked at the flattened area. There was no smell, no debris, no tracks I could make into anything. Deer bed down in places like that. Coyotes. It could have been any number of perfectly natural things. I took a few photographs, wrote the mileage in my notebook, got back in my car. I want to skip ahead here because the next 2 months were more of the same. Me driving that road, me looking at records, me telling myself this was nothing, me being unable to let it go. And I don't want to bore you with the accumulation. I'll tell you what the accumulation produced. 6 more names. Over the following 2 months, through a combination of things I could legitimately access as a cop and things I accessed because I grew up in a small town where everyone knows everyone, and people talk, I found 6 more people in and around Cavett who'd had some version of the same experience in the past 14 months. The vacancy, the gap, the window sitting. Some had seen doctors. Some hadn't. Some were aware of something having happened. Some just seemed different to the people around them and couldn't account for why. 10 people. Over 14 months. All within roughly a mile and a half of that stretch of Route 9. None of them had a medical explanation. None of them had a consistent trigger event. None of them had gotten worse over time. They'd all, in fact, gradually returned to something like themselves, which was part of why nobody had pushed harder. Everyone was fine now. Everything was fine. But something had happened to 10 people, and I was the only one who seemed to be holding all 10 names at the same time. I made a mistake in April. I brought what I had to my chief, a man named Dave Sutter, who'd been running the Cavett PD for about 6 years, and was a decent administrator and a genuinely good person. I laid it out as carefully as I could. The names, the timeline, the geographic correlation, the Route 9 connection. I did not speculate about what might be causing it. I just presented the pattern and said I thought it warranted looking into. Dave listened. He was patient. He didn't dismiss me out of hand. Then he said, "Jem, what are we looking into?" And I didn't have an answer. Because the pattern was real. I was certain of that. But a pattern is not a crime. A pattern is not even an incident. A pattern is something that happens to statistics, and statistics don't give you jurisdiction. Dave suggested the people might be connected in some way I hadn't found yet. Same water source, some kind of seasonal affective cluster, maybe a gas leak or carbon monoxide issue that nobody'd traced. He said he'd flag it with the county health office, which he probably did, and which produced nothing, because I checked. He did not tell me to drop it. But the way he looked at me when I left his office told me very clearly that he was going to watch to see if I needed to be talked to about proportionate response. So I stopped bringing it to work. I kept the notebook at home. I drove Route 9 on my own time. I told myself this was still within the bounds of reasonable professional concern and did not examine that claim too closely. May went by. June. I found 2 more names which brought the total to 12. The geographic cluster held. The timeline was now 16 months long. And then in July, one of the 12 called me. Her name was Beverly Ott. 61, retired schoolteacher, lived alone on the north end of Cutter Lane, which put her about 8 miles from Route 9. She'd been one of the ones I'd identified through the community network rather than official channels. A friend of a friend had mentioned she'd gone funny for a couple of weeks back in February, sitting at the window, not answering calls. She'd recovered. Seemed fine. She called my personal cell at 7:30 on a Thursday evening. She said she'd heard I'd been asking around. I said I'd been concerned about some people in the area and was trying to understand what they might have in common. She said, "You should come over." I think I know what we have in common. Beverly Ott's house was tidy and warm and smelled like coffee and old paperbacks. She was a sharp woman, clear-eyed, the kind of person who chooses her words carefully and means them. She told me that she'd been thinking about the episode in February ever since, and that she'd come to a conclusion that she'd been reluctant to share with anyone because it didn't make sense. I told her she should share it anyway. She said, "I think something was looking at me." Ugh. She held up a hand before I could respond. She said she knew how it sounded. She said she wasn't talking about a person. She wasn't talking about surveillance or a stalker or anything she had a word for. She was trying to describe a sensation she'd had during those 2 weeks, the weeks she barely remembered, and the best word she could find for it was attention. Something had been paying attention to her, not watching, not observing. Esther ending. Like a doctor attending a patient, or a person attending to a sound they can't quite hear. Something had been directing itself toward her, fully, the way you direct yourself toward a problem you're trying to solve. And she said she'd had the distinct impression that it wasn't trying to frighten her. It wasn't hostile. It was curious. It was trying to figure something out about her specifically, and the process of being figured out was what had produced the fog, the gap, the window sitting. She'd been a subject of study. She looked at me when she finished saying that and said, "I know the other ones felt it too. I've talked to 3 of them. They just don't have my vocabulary for it." Untwier. I sat in that house for 2 hours. Beverly had been talking to 3 of the others, Roy Stiller, Gerald Fitch, and a retired farmer named Ed Caulfield I'd only recently added to the list. She'd done it carefully, not wanting to prime their descriptions. She'd asked each of them separately to describe the experience without telling them how she'd described it. Roy had used the word studied. Gerald had said it felt like being translated. Ed Caulfield, a man who'd worked the same fields for 40 years and had approximately 0 interest in anything he couldn't fix with his hands, had thought for a long time, and then said it felt like the difference between being in an empty house and being in a house where someone is sleeping in the next room. You can't see them, you can't hear them, but the house feels different. 4 people, 4 descriptions, 1 shared core. I drove home that night and sat at my kitchen table for a while. My daughter was asleep. The house was quiet. I thought about being in a house where something is sleeping in the next room. I went back to that fence gap on Route 9 in August, 3 times in 1 week. I brought equipment I had no official authorization to be using for this purpose, a field spectrum analyzer that we kept for evaluating potential EMF sources in nuisance complaint situations. I'm not an expert in the device. I know enough to use it at a basic level. I found nothing abnormal. I also brought a thermal camera on the 3rd visit, borrowed from a friend who did home inspection work. I walked the flattened area in the dark at about 2 a.m. Nothing. Just grass and fence and the road and the flat Illinois sky. I went home. I slept. I went to work. And then on a Tuesday in October at 11:09 p.m., my personal phone rang. The number was 815 area code local, but I didn't recognize it. I almost didn't answer. It was late. I answered. It was Roy Stiller. He said, "It's back. I can feel it. I think it's doing it again." His voice was steady, not panicked. He sounded like a man describing symptoms to a doctor. Calm and precise, because precision was the only thing he had to offer. I asked him what it felt like right now at this moment. He said, like being looked at through something. Like there's a medium between it and me, and it's learning to account for the medium. Das I asked him where he was. He said he was at home, in his kitchen, same chair. I told him I was on my way. I got in my car and drove toward Cutter Lane, but on instinct I took Route 9 rather than the more direct way. I don't know why, it was not faster. At 11:13 p.m., as I passed the gap in the fence 2.2 miles north of the Cavett limit sign, my car's electronics went soft. Not off. Soft. The radio reduced itself to a hiss. The dashboard display dimmed. The headlights stayed on but seemed somehow less effective, like the dark was thicker than usual, which is not a thing I know how to explain in better terms than that. I pulled over, I got out, and I stood next to whatever was there. I cannot tell you what I saw, not because I won't tell you, but because what I experienced was not primarily visual. It was that sensation Beverly had described, attention in any store, but at a proximity and a magnitude that the word stops being adequate for. It was like standing next to an open transformer, but instead of electrical fields, you're feeling cognitive field, like something was running its attention over you the way your tongue runs over a loose tooth. Thorough, systematic. Interested. I was not frightened. That's the detail that still bothers me most. I was not frightened. I have been frightened in that job. Truly frightened. The adrenaline dumped kind of frightened. And this was not that. This was closer to awe. This was closer to the feeling of standing at the edge of something very large that you did not previously know existed. I stood there for what I later calculated to be 4 minutes. I know because the timestamp on the photograph I took of the empty grass is 11,014 p.m., and my dashboard clock read 11,018 when I got back in the car. In those 4 minutes, I had the clearest thought I have had in my adult life. The thought was, it is almost done, not done with me. I understood somehow that I had not been its focus. The 12 people, the people whose names were in my notebook, they had been the focus. I had been, at most, peripheral. I think it had noticed while it was noticing them, the way you notice a chair in the room where you're attending to something else, almost done with them. And in the same thought, I can't explain why these arrived together, the understanding that done stick did not mean finished in the way a project finishes. It meant done the way a photograph develops. The information it had gathered from 12 people was arriving at a resolution, coming into focus, and it would take that resolution, whatever it had learned, somewhere, back to wherever attention like that originates. This is the part where I know I've lost a portion of you. I understand. I was a cop for 13 years. I'm aware of how this reads. But I made a decision some time ago that I was going to tell this exactly as I experienced it, rather than shaping it into something more palatable, and I'm keeping that decision. Roy Stiller said the feeling passed around 11:30. I know because I'd driven to his house after leaving the fence gap, and I was sitting in his kitchen when it happened. He looked up from the table and exhaled slowly and said, "There it is." His face came back. Not fully, not right then, but the window closed. His expression assembled itself into something recognizable as present. He said, "It's gone." He said it the way you say something when you've been holding your breath for a very long time. I went back to Route 9 the next morning. The fence gap was there. The flattened area was there. Nothing was different. Nothing was there. And the absence was different from before. Before, when I'd gone out there and found nothing, the nothing had felt like concealment, like something present that was not presenting itself. This nothing felt like a room the morning after the guests have left, slept in stillness, the particular quiet of a space that has been occupied and is now not. I stood there for a while. I took no photographs because there was nothing to photograph. Then I drove back to town. I handed in my resignation 4 months later. Not immediately because I wasn't ready to explain it, and I needed time to be sure of what I was sure of. I told Dave Sutter I was going through some personal changes and thought it was time to try something different. He was understanding. We had a good conversation. He said I'd been a good officer. I believe he meant it. I did not tell him about the notebook. I did not tell him about Beverly's word, or Roy's word, or Gerald's word, or Ed Caulfield's quiet, precise description of the house with something sleeping in the next room. I took the notebook home, and I still have it. The 12 people are all fine. I want to be clear about that because I've thought about it a great deal, and I think it's the most important and the most unsettling part of the whole thing. Nobody was harmed. Roy Stiller, as far as I know, is still in his house on Cutter Lane. Gerald Fitch is still doing maintenance at the school district. Beverly Ott is probably still reading, probably still choosing her words with that particular precision. Whatever happened to them, whatever they were subjects of, whatever attention was directed at them for those days or weeks, it did not leave them damaged. It left them with a gap in their memory and a description they couldn't quite make fit any existing category, and I've tried to decide how I feel about that, because on one hand, no one was hurt. Whatever it was, it did not seem malicious. It seemed, and I use this word carefully, knowing that I am applying a human framework to something that may have no use for human frameworks, considerate. Like it was trying to minimize the disturbance of something it couldn't do without disturbing it all. But on the other hand, 12 people in my town were examined without their knowledge or consent by something that has no place in any framework I was trained in or have since developed. They were attended to, studied, translated, as Gerald put it, and they will never know the full scope of what was extracted from them, and neither will I. And whatever it learned from them, whatever resolution that attention produced, it took away and used for something, and I have no idea what. I don't live in Cavett anymore. I moved about 8 months after I resigned. Not because I was afraid. I've thought a lot about whether it was fear, and I don't think it was exactly, but because I found I couldn't do the job the town needed from me anymore. The job requires a framework. It requires a set of categories within which things can be placed and addressed, and I had stood next to something that had quietly demonstrated that my categories were insufficient, and I couldn't unsee that. You can't enforce order in a place when you've been shown that you don't fully understand the place. I looked at that photograph again last night. The one from 11:14 p.m. October, Route 9 fence, post, gravel shoulder, tall grass, nothing. And I thought about the thought I'd had while standing there. The one that arrived fully formed, in language I didn't generate. It is almost done. I've wondered for 4 years whether that thought was mine. Whether that was my brain, exhausted and primed and reaching for pattern and landing on something, the way brains do. Whether the whole thing, the attention, the presence, the cognitive field, the awe, was my brain under pressure generating experience, because brains do that too, and I am not so certain of my own objectivity that I can rule it out. But here is what I come back to. 12 people, same descriptions, no contact with each other before Beverly started quietly comparing notes, the same core, studied, translated, attended to. The house where something was sleeping in the next room. That's not my brain-generating experience. That's a town that was visited by something, and the only way it knew how to visit, which was quietly and thoroughly and with complete indifference to being understood. I have one thing left to say, and then I'm done. About 3 months after I left Cavett, I had a conversation with Beverly Ott on the phone. We stayed in touch. She called to check in, the way she does. We talked for a while. Before she hung up, she said something I've been sitting with ever since. She said, "You know what I keep thinking? I keep thinking it learned what it came to learn and left. And I keep trying to decide if that's awful or if that's just how it is, when something much larger than you takes an interest in you for a while and then moves on. And I think the answer might be that those two things aren't different." I said I thought that was probably right. She said, "That's the part that's hard to live with. Not that it was here. That it's somewhere else now, and it's using what it learned, and we'll never know from what. Usk." I still drive sometimes at night, not in Cavett, wherever I am now. Just long county roads, the kind that go dark between small towns. I don't know what I'm looking for. I don't think I'm looking for it specifically. I think I've become a person who pays attention to roads at night in a different way than I used to. The photograph on my phone is still there. I've never deleted it. I'm not sure why I feel like I shouldn't.